Welcome to the Farm Family Harmony podcast. I'm your host, Elaine Froese, Canada's Farm Whisperer. I've been helping farm families in agriculture find harmony for over 30 years, and now I'm bringing some simple, practical tools to you. Get help here creating transition plans and learn how to talk through the tough topics and conversations with your farm family. Now let's get into this episode topic. I'm so glad you're here. You today to meet our guest, my coach, Lydia Carpenter. And Lydia, just to get started for our listeners, I think it would be exciting to frame this conversation around how to get started in transition conversations. And you do a lot of our team's discovery calls when people are just getting started into the coaching process. But before we jump to coaching, just tell our listeners about how you became a first-generation farmer.
Well, my husband and I, Vian, we started farming over a decade ago now. We were in our mid-20s when we started. He had come at the age of 15 from South Africa and always wanted to farm, but like me, had also grown up in a city. He's from Pretoria and I grew up in Winnipeg. And in our early 20s, he worked on farms from the time he was 18 years old once he came to Canada, but starting in our early 20s, we started farming together on leased land. I remember having a conversation with him and it sort of went something like, there has to be a thing where people rent a certain amount of land per year, per dollar amount, and I'm sure we can figure that out. And so we set out to find some rentable acres. We weren't in a position to buy land, so we knew we were going to have to invest in something that was portable, that had legs, and so we opted to get into livestock. And over the years, we leased land for over 7 years, growing our land base year after year. We built a direct market for the beef that we were producing until about 5 or 6 years ago, a neighboring landowner and a friend of ours who didn't have a successor. They have a young daughter, but as far as who would be taking over the operation, they didn't have anyone, and they also wanted to give a young couple an opportunity, so they sold us land. And we built a direct market beef business, and that is really what supported us. So we have a really great customer base of people. And so over time on leased acres, I remember feeling like, agriculture was not a playground that we had played on before as children.
Right.
We didn't grow up in agriculture, and I had this sense that there were things that we just didn't understand because we didn't grow up in farming. And so we really put our heads down and committed to just learning everything we could. We joined grazing clubs. We went to conferences. We one of the things that you talk about, Elaine, is asking for what you need.
Right.
And I remember realizing and saying to Vian, you know what? People don't know what we need. And I think we just have to ask. And the worst that they can say is, no, that's not workable for me.
So your business is called Luna Field Farm, and that's how people can find you on Facebook. So you live in Southwest Manitoba, Lydia, and service largest cities of Winnipeg, which is where you grew up, and Brandon. And I think what's amazing in your empathy as a coach that's so strong is because you're profitable after 10 years, you can give a lot of young farmers a sense of hope in terms of, what it takes to start from nothing. And most of the people that we coach are already successors or potential successors to an existing operation. So as you do your intake calls we call them discovery calls, when people call us and want to find out about our coaching process, what do you think the key things are? Because in terms of starting the transition conversation, because we did a survey after the webinar I did in December with RBC, and how to start the conversation or how to get people to talk has been a huge deal. And you've also done you have a master's, you've also done a lot of training in mediation and conflict resolution. And you and I sometimes joke that we're weird because we actually like sitting in conflict to help people find options, because we don't find it as something that's a wall. We find it more like an adventure. So tell us what you think that you're seeing when you do those discovery calls.
I would say, just as far as my perspective goes in agriculture, I would say I'm definitely optimistic, because, you're not necessarily going to start a business in agriculture if you're not naturally optimistic, but also very realistic. And I appreciate that people have different contexts and different situations. And my curiosity is kind of figuring out where they're at right now and what the dynamics are. And, understanding that, there are just so many things and so many stories. And as far as the discovery process go, I just want to be very open to listening and hearing where people are at. I'm a sort of a strategic thinker. So, I sometimes feel like I have to pull back and really focus and really hear where people are at, where they want to go next, who they want to involve in this process. But because I see opportunity, and because I'm, like you, Elaine, I see opportunity in conflict. I see creativity in conflict. And I have this sense that if they're willing, people can get there too. And, like you mentioned, speaking to young people in agriculture, I had a sense when I was in my 20s that there was so much that I had to learn, and there was so much opportunity to do that. There was so much opportunity for mentorship. And so I'm trying to find in the spaces the light that's coming through. Where's the opportunity? Where can this conversation go? What are the questions that have to be asked? What do you want from this process?
So
what do you hope for?
So when someone calls us and you're doing the discovery call, it would be helpful if they knew what they wanted, right? What they're going for. You also said it would also be helpful if you could restore some sense of hope to them and opportunity, because they're feeling quite negative and quite stuck. And we have an online course called Get Farm Transition Unstuck. So what other things, when someone picks up the phone and says, I think I'll call farmfamilycoach.com and talk to Elaine and Lydia, what do you think they need to have some self-awareness about when they say, how do we get people to the table? What would your first answer be?
Yeah, if they're trying to figure out how to get people to the table, one of the questions when people call, one of the things that we're looking for is, what motivated you to make this initial call? What motivated you to reach out?
Why today?
Why today? Have you communicated any of these concerns or needs or desires with any of your family members? So in other words, who can, where's the trust? Who do you feel connected to in your family? Who wants to be involved in this process? And what do the next steps look like moving forward? And, sometimes I'll do a discovery call and people are uncertain about how to take that next step. And so I'll provide them with a bit of instruction, or even offer an additional discovery call to a family member that may also be feeling really stuck. And so it's kind of just focusing on what's the next step that we can take, and what are your hopes and desires, or, desired outcomes for this process.
So one of the things that helps us get a pretty quick survey, Lydia, is to do a family map. And we've called this podcast the Family Harmony Podcast. And we did that intentionally because in our coaching team, our mantra is helping farm families find harmony through understanding. So can you explain to the listeners what the dynamics are, what the sweet spot is of actually taking time to put your family down on paper with ages and stages, and what that shows us very quickly?
Yeah, so one of the first steps is, I don't want people to be alarmed when we ask them what their age is, but we'll write down their names, marriages, partnerships, relationships, children, and we'll start marking down, the different ages of everybody. So the ages of the founders, the ages of the children, and what that shows us is where everybody is at. So if we're receiving a call, let's say from a daughter-in-law or a son-in-law or a son or daughter, and they're in their mid-30s and they're trying to figure out what their next step is, as far as assuming more management or a transition of labor, or how they're going to start accessing assets. They're trying to, they're working towards mastery. They want to know at 35 moving into 40 where they're going to be at. They want to have some control over things. And so that is a good indication for us of where they're at when we can figure out their age. If we have founders that call us that are, in their late 70s or sort of mid 70s and want to take the next step in, transitioning more assets to their children, they're really at a place where, they need to be letting go of some of that control and moving it towards the children. They might want to travel or be doing different things, or be concerned about health issues. And so it really just gives us an indication of where people are at.
And what's your response when people are still not convinced that they're going to get people to the table? What other tools do you offer them to assure them that it's an unfolding process?
Well, it is certainly a journey, and we can do some one-on-one coaching with folks. We also have resources that we can send them. I do, as I mentioned earlier, I'll often offer to speak with other family members or provide them with additional resource, because I appreciate that if everyone's coming to this at a different stage of interest. In other words, whatever's motivated you to reach out or make that first call, that process is different for you than it might be for your spouse or your child or your in-law or whatever it is. And so what might be some practical next steps for them so they can meet you where you're at, right? So we have sometimes we'll send videos or podcasts or books, offer additional discovery calls, do some one-on-one coaching, right? So we focus on transition, legacy, conflict resolution. And so sometimes there's some conflict resolution work that can be done. We can do some individual conflict coaching. We can do some mediation. We can just provide that initial one-on-one time to everybody so that they feel heard, and then figure out, if a family meeting is feasible or can be done later on.
So Lydia, we have this saying, I think we've even put it on one of our t-shirts: love does not read minds.
No.
And I think when people are saying to me, Elaine, how do we get people to the table? One of the tips that I've given on many podcasts is to collect your thoughts by writing a letter and presenting that letter to the other generation, and so that there's a time to process that. But can you speak to the audience around what assumptions, let's do it in a couple of stages. What assumptions do you think young farmers are making that maybe should be broken out?
Well, I can speak maybe from personal experience, and my experience is a little different because we often worked with neighbors and leased land from individuals, and we weren't necessarily working with family. But even the idea that people know what we need or want,
right?
And that was actually really eye-opening for me, because when we started to get clear, and we had to be clear for ourselves about what we needed and what we wanted. And so we had to have a really good understanding about our business, that it was profitable, that it could service debt. But once we kind of understood that, and we started going to people and saying, what, here's our plan. So having a plan.
A business plan,
yeah. Presenting that plan to people as a point of interest and a point of entry into conversation. So things are not necessarily black and white. And I remember starting to really, have that conversation, and people were very open. I say people, I mean other farmers, neighbors, very open to how they might be able to support us.
So sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Elaine.
Well, I'm just trying to put myself in someone else's shoes of a young farmer listening to this and saying, well, Elaine, I have no idea what I have access to. And again, your first comment, Lydia, is being able to ask, right? The person can say no, but breaking down those assumptions by asking. So if you have a young farmer who's in a family business, you're in a non-family partnership. If you have somebody in a family business, what kinds of things do they need to do to collect data to be able to develop that business plan? Because many families that you and I come across don't have a lot of financial transparency between the generations. So talk about financial transparency.
Yeah, and I was just having this conversation with someone the other day, having a better understanding of what the enterprises are and what the gross profit analysis is. And after years of being on the operation, not having a really good grasp on what that looks like, and that a lot of the information and data is, in the heads of the founders, or just not on paper in a place where they can access it, or just has not felt available to them. And part of it is, I would say for young people too, is knowing what questions to ask. So I appreciate that there can be challenges intergenerationally with just sharing information, but first of all, you have to know what questions to ask. And so early on, sort of, if you need to understand the profitability, what questions do you need to ask? And then how do we get that down on paper? And for the founding generation, also having that information so that you can share it. And so in this case in particular, one of the options was to go to your accountant and get them to sort through the information so that they could present it to both the founder and the next generation, and so that they could see it together, and it could be presented to them together. But getting that financial transparency either on the operation as a whole or on different aspects of the operation is really important, so that the next generation can decide like what's workable. And as far as what do you need to know, I mean, I think that having some responsibility financially for an enterprise can be really helpful. And so what do I have access to? Okay, what are my assets?
Right, what are my personal net worth is?
Yeah, personal net worth. What are my current liabilities, if any, and how much debt can I service?
Oh, do you mean young farmers have to go into debt, Lydia?
Oh yes, I've learned this too.
So you and Vion, in the last 10 years of farming, started with almost nothing. How did you, and I think this is a very valid thing, because people are becoming very saddened or frustrated about how are they going to scrape together enough capital, enough cash to pay down debt or to pay any kind of debt. And so what worked for you and Vion? How did you guys get enough cash together to actually start paying for land and paying for tractors and things like that?
Yeah, and that's where so we started with the market, and we knew as first generation, not having not coming in with community relationships where we could enter into a grain farm or enter into like a really well-established operation right from the beginning. We had to start with our market. So we knew that we were going to direct market right from the get-go. That is right. We didn't start with very much money. We had $40,000 in savings. And then I worked for the first few years full time. And we just invested our money back into livestock.
So you lived very intentionally though, Lydia. You kept very good track of your numbers.
We kept very good track of our numbers. I recognized very early on that wasn't my strong suit. And when I say early on, I mean within the first 6 months of the first year, because it caused me a certain level of anxiety that I had to be organized enough that to be able to make good decisions in the future. So one of the first things that we did, even though we really didn't have a profitable business, was hire a bookkeeper, because it was a way to outsource some of the work that I found,
taxing,
taxing, and I knew was going to pay dividends. And so we outsourced the bookkeeping early on. In the first year, we grossed, maybe $100,000, and we doubled every year after that as we move forward. And a few of the things is like we would just live wherever we could find appropriate housing that was near to the land we were leasing. And every year we got better with our lease agreements, in the sense that we started to know what to ask for. So one of our first leases was only year to year, and we realized that was not tenable.
Not long enough.
Next lease, it wasn't long enough. And the next lease we did a 3-year rolling lease, so that every year we'd have a year added on, but the landowner only required 1 year for us to exit. So we started to get really good about getting things in writing and having a plan that was further out.
And I want to stop you there, because we got really good at having things in writing. How did that change your anxiety?
It gave me a sense of security. It made me feel empowered, and it actually brought us into a really meaningful and good relationship with the people that we had things in writing with. And I would say those things, first of all, it was a shared attitude, because we did have different land leases. We were working with different individuals. We could move closer to people that shared our philosophy around having things in writing, longer term leases, because we had that flexibility. We weren't necessarily working only in family. We were able to sort of work in community. So it helped. It was an immense change, because we were going year to year, and now we could see the next 3 years. We could see the next 5 years.
It gave you less anxiety over the uncertainty of your future.
Yeah.
Because you were creating more certainty for your future. And that's actually a line in our key challenge audit that we give to coaching families when they first start working with us, that so many young farmers check off. Elaine, one of our key challenges is how do we decrease our anxiety over the uncertainty of the future? And I think that's why people are telling us, just please tell us how we can get people to talk. Tell us how we can get people to come to the transition table. And so Lydia, what do you do when you're doing your coaching work and when you and I are doing family meetings together, because that's the goal. After all this individual coaching, we want to get people all to the table at the same time. So there's no guessing and there's no surprises. What do you do to create that certainty for people within the family meeting? Can you describe what happens at a family meeting to help decrease anxiety? How do you keep it safe and respectful? Because I think people are terrified talking about, we've already talked about financial transparency. And I was coaching someone recently who was terrified to let the daughter-in-law know how wealthy the farm was. And I said, well, she needs to know, especially if her husband is going to be the successor of the farm. And what's the big deal here? So how do you keep the meeting safe and respectful? How do you help people open up to speak in those meetings?
Before we come to the family meeting, we have that one-on-one time. And I think part of it is like just carrying some of that story for them. And that we talked about uncertainty, and I know how that feels. And not even within family, just generally, right? Because we farm with outside of family. I know how physical that can feel. And for the founders, not to know what the plan is or not to know who this, like, I know, we can just imagine how that feels. And one of the things that I often tell clients is, first of all, just as far as facilitation goes, we provide the facilitation. So you don't have to be the one to ask the questions and carry the heaviness of those questions. We know why those questions are important, and we can help ask those questions. And so, we carry, and I'll often say this to clients, whatever we talk about in our one-on-ones, that's between us, but it's confidential, but we, those insights that you provide us help drive the questions, because we know what is really concerning for you or where you need answers. And we give everybody an opportunity to speak. And we do address, if it occurs, we'll say, we don't, it's a safe space. If there are, bad behaviors, for example, or, and it's very common that if the family was trying to facilitate their own family meeting and tensions rise, they don't necessarily have strategy to move it forward. And that's where the conflict resolution comes in. We have strategies to move it forward. And then at the end of the meeting, we talk about next steps and creating a timeline, and we write those down. And so part of it is talking about, where we're at now and then where we want to go, but also, putting tasks and timelines onto it. And then I'll often tell people, we don't just leave you at the end of the family meeting, we do follow-up. So there's that accountability piece where, if in the past you have felt like, or someone in the family has felt like they're in the middle or they have to manage that, we can help with that as well. And so, bringing in a third party or bringing in someone who, understands or wants to understand where everyone's at. And, I think of it as unconditional positive regard, like holding everybody in positive regard.
Right.
Or this idea of balanced partiality. We're working for the family. We're working for the farm.
We're working for the good of all, right?
We're working for the good of all.
Clarity of expectations. Certainty of timelines and agreements, which you talked about in the list of action steps, and it's by when, there's dates and timelines put on that. And then a commitment to act, because, a lot of people, I think, listening to this love to watch home improvement shows and do-it-yourself kind of construction projects. But I think the other reason that people are afraid to come to the table is because they don't want to have an explosion of conflict that they can't handle. But in the intake process of describing and doing the family mapping, and in the process of doing the one-on-one coaching, there's lots of baby steps before you get to the family meeting to help everyone practice new language, practice asking better questions. And I'm just smiling at a family meeting that you and I just did last week, where I'm writing the notes, you're facilitating, and I'm keeping track on this huge 34-point font, whiteboard that we have on the Zoom call. And at the end of the meeting, they say, well, do we get to keep the notes? And I just looked at them and I said, yes, of course. This is you. This is all about you. And they were so pleased when we asked them what was most valuable. And so what do you think is the most valuable, Lydia? And you've done hundreds of intake calls now. You've been coaching with me and our team for over a year. You've done heaps of training in conflict and resolution and mediation, and you're a voracious reader. What do you think has been the most amazing breakthrough for you as a coach to see people's behavior shift once they understand how the process can really empower them?
That is a great question, Elaine. And
I'm just
probably,
trying to put myself in the shoes of the listeners here, because so many people reach out to us and they're at the end of their sense of hope. And there's a verse in Proverbs that says, hope deferred makes the heart sick. And we want to give them positivity. And so I'm thinking of all the things that they say at the end of that family meeting, Lydia, and that time coaching with you. What's the one thing that's going to help them break through to start the process to have a different outcome?
So often I get the sense that there was, we talk about this with the pandemic, but the before times and the after times
of the great pause.
Yeah. And I get this sense sometimes that people are learning new skills. They're learning conflict resolution skills. They're learning things that they didn't even know they didn't know. And because we don't talk about conflict in community in the way we talk about bushels per acre, for example,
or what the weather's like.
What the weather's like, yeah. It's almost a realization that, actually, there's a skill set here that I can develop, or that I didn't know I didn't have, and there is hope, but also this feeling that we're talking now, or we're talking in a way we weren't talking before,
and it's safe.
And for me, I would say, what is really eye-opening is that sometimes people will talk about things in the family meeting that, because, maybe because we're involved in conflict resolution, or because, at a young age, I was pushed to a place in agriculture where I kind of had to ask for what I need. I'm sometimes seeing people ask questions they've never asked before. And I'm thinking, oh my, like, this is the first time, like, this is great. This is excellent. And it's just that before and after, having somebody facilitate or just support you through that conversation and ask you the questions where in a safe space where others can hear you. And so often people will say, when we talk about what was valuable for you, so often people will say, just having a conversation.
Right.
Understanding, hearing mom say things I've never heard her say before. And I think for me, as a facilitator, like, that is really powerful, even though it might seem quite simple or straightforward, just to have a conversation.
Well, and that was the whole purpose of this podcast, Lydia, was to just open the box of possibility of how to get conversations started. And my coaching training at the Hudson Institute in Santa Barbara, I always remember they said, we hold the space as a coach. Yeah. We're not the conduit of messages between the family members, because all the coaching work we do is confidential.
That's right.
But as you hold the space, what you're talking about in facilitation, you can ask really powerful questions to draw out those kinds of comments and insights that maybe have never been audibly spoken before and never landed. The other thing you just said is that people feel seen and heard. And that's probably the biggest longing of the in-laws, the son-in-laws and the daughter-in-laws, is that they have a voice in the decision-making of the family that they've become part of, that they have insight, and that they have respect for how they have a vision for how things want to go forward. So I really want to thank you for your time. I hope that by listening to this, people get a better sense of the work you do in discovery calls at farmfamilycoach.com. And listeners, if you want to do a discovery call with Lydia and our team, you're more than welcome to just go to farmfamilycoach.com and fill in our contact page. And also we have other resources for you to help you get started. It says we're at the beginning of a new journey, Lydia. We have other coaches on our team who have different skill sets, but I think I always laugh when you and I talk about, liking transformation through conflict to be a little bit on the weird side, but I just did another podcast on procrastination. And I think it's that conflict avoidance that's really, really hurting families and keeping them stuck. So of all the things that we've talked about this morning, Lydia, what's the one thing that you want families to really land on today?
I just want people to know you're not alone.
Mm.
You know, you just having that conversation with with your family, or initially having that conversation with someone who can hear you and understand, is just so powerful. And that there is a next step as part of this journey.
Thanks so much for your time. And folks, if you want to find out more about Lydia and her direct farm marketing, just look for Lunafield Farm, and you can connect with Lydia also that way and through Farm Family Coach. Thanks for joining us today. Hope this has made a difference. Please share it with your friends, and we'll see you next time. Are you in a farm family that's struggling with getting a transition plan? Most farmers across North America do not have a written plan due to procrastination or conflict avoidance. That's why I've created the Farm Family Harmony membership. It will help farm families get past those barriers and finally make a plan that gives everyone clarity, peace of mind, and harmony back on their farm.